Hey folks, and welcome back to the video lectures for Philosophy 114 Global Moral Issues. So, what we're doing in this unit is a little more intro type material, but rather than being about the class, it's a little bit more about our subject matter. So, the title of the class is Global Moral Issues, and so far we've looked at a little bit of what philosophy is and how we do it, what some of the methods and tools we can use for all that is. We've not looked at how to do the moral part of all this. So, this lecture is going to give us a bit of an overview of what is this kind of subject matter that we actually deal with in this class, the specific version of the kinds of philosophical material that we discussed in the last unit. And we'll look a little bit at the different branches of ethics, this part of philosophy, and we'll look at some general assumptions and things that go into how we read and approach and deal with all the different problems we'll be talking about. And then the rest of the unit will give us a little bit of an overview on uh, how to go about evaluating and comparing the different perspectives and viewpoints and theories that we deal with for the rest of the semester. But before we get too far into all of that, I want to start us off with a little bit of a story, a hypothetical sort of story. So, suppose that you're walking around one day in downtown Lafayette, Indiana, and you're admiring all of the new things that have been put in this last construction season before the snow comes. And you notice that they've put in a brand new, wonderful public transit system to help deal with the horrible traffic in certain parts of town. And so, as you're walking around downtown and you're admiring the new public transit system, a trolley car system, a lot like what you'd find in San Francisco, you notice that a horrible tragedy is about to occur. You see a trolley car run away and out of control, hurtling down the tracks. And you also notice that on the tracks here in town, there are 5 people trapped on the trolley car tracks, just a little ways down the path. And due to construction fencing and rubble and buildings and everything else, these 5 people cannot get out of the way in time. They are going to be killed for certain. You're absolutely sure. Now, being the observant university student that you are, you also notice, though, that there is a side track that the trolley car is running on. And you notice that there's a lever that's actually right by your hand. And that if you throw that lever, you can divert the trolley car onto the side track, onto the spur, and save those 5 people's lives. But you also notice that on this side track, there is one person who will not be able to get out of the way in time. And so you know that if you throw the switch, it is certain that that one person will die, but you'd save the lives of the 5. We don't have to worry about any sort of prediction or uh, knowledge issues right here. You're intelligent folks. You can read the situation pretty well. So, given this, I have a question for you. Would you throw the lever? Would you kill one to save 5? Think about it for a moment. The majority of folks do actually decide and say, yes, they should throw the lever. It's far more morally permissible to kill one to save 5. This is seemingly an obvious choice. A few folks disagree, though. Some would say that no, it's wrong to throw the lever. And an even smaller minority say that, well, it's really not right for me to get involved at all, even though 5 people died in my inaction. It's just not my place to get involved in this sort of thing. I'm not responsible. But the majority opinion does seem to be here that it's right to throw the lever, kill one, save 5. The numbers just work out that way. But suppose we think of another scenario. Suppose that once again you're walking around downtown Lafayette. Only this time, instead of walking around by the trolley tracks, you admire a brand new pedestrian bridge that's been installed over Main Street, Lafayette. And again, you notice that we have a runaway trolley car problem going on right now. Whether the transit authority messed things up in the first place or whether, like a lot of government projects, it just hasn't worked out very well. Either way, there is yet another trolley car running out of control, hurtling down the tracks towards 5 people who, just like in the first case, are trapped and cannot escape. But Being the astute STEM student or whatever major you are, you also notice that there is a very, very fat man next to you there on the pedestrian bridge, which passes over the train tracks. And when I talk about a fat man, I'm not saying the man's overweight. I'm talking about the deserves his own TLC show. It's a miracle this guy is walking degree of fat. Now, it occurs to you as an observant college student with at least a passable background in STEM that you could give this fat man a push. And with the slightest push in the right place, the man would topple from the bridge to the tracks, and his mass would be sufficient to actually stop the trolley car before it reaches the 5 people, who again will certainly die if you do not do anything. However, fat men and trolleys don't mix. So if you push the fat man will certainly die. So now we again have a moral sort of question. Should you push the fat man? Here I imagine that a lot of you are suddenly a lot more reluctant to kill one to save 5. It seems somehow worse to push the fat man than it was to throw the switch in the first case. But this seems a little bit odd. A question arises. What happened to the principle that we were using in this first case? What happened to the idea that it's morally right to sacrifice 1 to save 5? Why doesn't the number of lives being saved justify killing the fat man? This seems odd, so let's consider at least one more scenario. Now, suppose this time you decide to change your major partway through college and you become a doctor. Or maybe if you're planning on being a medical doctor in the first place, you succeed. Congratulations. And as part of your post-med school work, whether your residency or your first bid as an independent doctor, you work at a trauma center for at least one rotation. And a group of 5 patients all come in at once. There's been a horrible trolley car accident, turns out. And each of these 5 patients now needs an organ transplant in order to live. And they each one need a different organ. Let's say one needs a heart, one a liver, one a kidney, one a lung, and one a pancreas or something like that. Either way, you have 5 people in desperate need of an organ transplant within the next 24 hours, or they will certainly perish. You know this as a medical expert. Now, you also know, thanks to being observant and doing your rounds and everything, that in the next room over, just across the hall from these poor 5 very badly wounded people, there's a healthy man who's come in for a checkup, and he's lightly napping in the next room over. And it occurs to you that if you were to go in there and close the door, you could harvest that healthy man's organs, killing him, of course, and then use those to perform transplants to save the 5 lives across the hall. All you'd have to do is sacrifice 1, and you could save 5 lives. So again, we can ask the question, should you kill the sleeping patient in the next room to save the 5 transplant victims? Here I imagine very few of you are feeling compelled to say yes, that you ought, or that you even would kill the 1 to save 5. If you are somebody who would do that sort of thing, statistically, you are very much in the minority across almost everyone who gets shown this series of cases. Now, here's why we're talking about this sort of thing, and here's the interesting bit of all this. As we move through these 3 different cases, we have a similar sort of situation where we have to choose whether or not to allow the few to suffer for the benefit of the many. We have the opportunity to save a large number of lives in exchange for the sacrifice or the killing of 1 life. And in each case, we have different sorts of intuitive pulls. The principles that we might have used in the first spur case are different from the ones that apply in the fat man case, and we have something else going on entirely in the doctor's case. So our philosophical question is, what gives? What is going on here that makes these 3 cases so different? What happened to the principle that seemed so obvious and so sure in the first case, and why doesn't it carry over into the others? This sort of thing is a famous sort of problem. It's something that there are answers to, but they're not all widely accepted. They're all three of these situations are what we call thought experiments. They're imaginary or hypothetical scenarios that illustrate a point, provoke a particular intuition, or demonstrate a problem. And trolley problems like this, these demonstrate a lot of different things. Some people use them to demonstrate points about abortion or the difference between killing and letting die, or the difference that proximity to a problem makes. If I'd substituted your mother for one of the random people on the track, your answers would also change. So trolley problems are used for a lot of different things, but in this case, I've used them or am intending to use them to show that even though some moral problems seem absolutely obvious to most of us, and that we may even have widespread agreement about them, there's some sort of a real puzzle going on between these things that common sense and intuition doesn't seem to answer adequately. It doesn't seem like there's an obvious or clear answer as to why the principles that apply here don't apply here, or and why this is far more similar to the doctor case than it is the trolley car, even though things are all set up almost exactly the same. So it seems as though there are at least some moral problems that we really need some additional work to actually go through, that we need to try and solve systematically, that we need to try and approach rationally, because common sense doesn't seem to cut it in a lot of cases. There are real questions and problems that need to be solved. Because even though these are nicely illustrated vector drawings and they illustrate these nice imaginary situations, there are very real versions of these that actually happen. In World War II, for example, during the Battle of Britain, Winston Churchill actually faced a variation of a trolley problem when dealing with the Nazi Germany's bombing of London. The Germans were sending V 2 rockets launched from the European continent across the water and were targeting them on various parts of London, attacking civilians. And through a few different intelligence operatives, the British had discovered that the Germans didn't actually know where the rockets were landing all of the time. The technology wasn't far enough along for that sort of thing yet. And so they discovered that the rockets, for one, were veering a certain distance and angle off target consistently. They were drifting in a certain regular, predictable pattern. And they also figured out which spies Germany was using to identify where the targets hit. And they were using that for their targeting decisions. And so Churchill and his war council decided, or at least noticed, that if they fed false information about the rockets to the German spies, they could actually get the Germans to start shifting the targets of those attacks south. And they would start hitting the less populated southern side of London instead of the more densely populated northern side. But because of the particular variance on those rockets, that part of London was entirely safe during the attacks for the most part. They would be intentionally exposing a small number of people who were previously safe to new danger in exchange for the lives of the more densely areas of the city. Now, in the end, Churchill, I guess to his credit, to a certain, depending on your moral beliefs, did decide to do this sort of thing. He did decide to feed false information to the Germans and saved countless British lives by doing so, at even the risk of his own family, because his family lived in this southern part of London and had this sort of risk. And we have other situations that show up in this sort of thing, lifeboat scenarios where we're trying to decide uh, who should get the last bit of food, or in one tragic and famous case involving a captain and a cabin boy and a couple of other survivors adrift at sea, deciding whether or not to eat the cabin boy who was going to die of sickness anyway, in order to save the four other starving men there on the lifeboat. And this was a case that caused great uproar in the 19th century in the United Kingdom. So even though trolley problems and things like them are imaginary, there are very similar, very real cases and problems. And if we don't have a consistent way to approach these, that seems like a real challenge. That seems like a problem. It seems like we ought to be able to approach these and figure out some sort of a solution. Churchill had to, the captain and the cabin boy had to. Uh, we need solutions to these kinds of problems, and it looks like common sense doesn't cut it. So, in those types of situations, we can look to the philosophy. We can look to uh, philosophy as a field because it has a branch, ethics, or also known as moral philosophy, that tackles these kinds of questions and tries to figure out systematic ways of answering and approaching these things. And as an aside, just for now and for the rest of the semester, it's worth noting that the terms ethics and morals are, for our purposes, the exact same thing. They are literally the Greek and Latin versions of the same ancient word, meaning character or habits. Uh, the Greek term is ethos, the Latin term is mores. They both mean character or habits. They're just translations of the same term. So, as far as we're concerned, we'll use the terms ethics and morality to mean virtually the same thing. And so, if I talk about one and switch to the other, this is not a shift in subject matter. It's just I changed it up for the sound of it, or perhaps it seemed better just for readability at the time. But so here's a little bit about ethics, since this is what the majority of our semester is going to be spent focusing on. Ethics is the branch of philosophy that studies questions about how we should act and live. That is, it looks at the fundamental questions of how we ought to live our lives. And so this makes it fundamentally normative. That means that it's a subject matter that discusses norms, standards, rules, and ideals. So when we talk about moral philosophy, we talk about how people should act, and we don't worry about how people actually act. So our questions are not about what people do in situations or what they would do in a situation, but rather what they should do. What ought they do? What sort of norms and standards and principles should we be living by? And so, sorry, cat distracted me. So, when we talk about all of this, we're not going to be doing the same sort of work that sociology or, say, anthropology would do when we look at what a culture believes about these things and what they do in a given situation. Instead, we're going to be talking about what ought to be done in a given topic. And this branch of philosophy has itself three sub branches that approach different kinds of questions. The first of these is metaethics, and we'll do a little bit of this over the course of both this unit and off and on throughout the semester. Metaethics is the branch of ethics that deals with the foundations of morality. Essentially, if we have to come up with theories and principles about how we ought to live, metaethics is the branch of philosophy that focuses on what sort of building blocks should we build those theories out of. Metaethics is the branch of ethics that focuses on things like, are there actually answers to moral questions? Are there actually objectively correct answers? What does the term right mean? What is goodness? What sorts of things are valuable? Uh, what does it mean for something to be valuable? These are the kinds of things that metaethics tackles. Just as a clue, anytime you see any version of the word meta in any sort of term, in any field, meta generally means beyond or about. And so when we talk about metaethics, we're talking about ethics uh, rather than doing ethics itself in a lot of normal ways. Now, normative ethics is probably what a lot of people think of when they think of philosophers doing ethics. Normative ethics studies what is actually right and wrong and why those things are right and wrong. Normative ethics is where we build a lot of our actual theories about right and wrong and what's moral and not moral and so on. And this, for the most part, is something that we'll reference now and then, but we won't be digging into a lot of the theoretical issues for most of the semester. Instead, our focus is mainly going to be in the area of applied ethics. Applied ethics is the branch of ethics that focuses on particular problems and issues, and what are the relevant parts of those problems and issues? What are the things that we need to be aware of? What are the unique aspects of this topic or this problem? And how should that affect our moral thinking? So, applied ethics is where we approach the sorts of things we talk about in this class once we get past this initial couple of units. Applied ethics is where we investigate things like environmental ethics or issues of equality, issues of free speech. We'll look at applications of ethical theories to warfare in the next unit and see whether or not there are rules about warfare or whether or not going to war is ever actually morally justified. Things that, unfortunately, in our political climate and just the global uh, political situation at the moment is all too relevant. So, applied ethics is where we're going to spend most of our time, but we'll make reference to and do a little bit of study in the other two branches as well. Now, when we do all of this, I mentioned on the last slide that we're mainly dealing with normative issues here. But it's worth noting that the kinds of norms and things that we're talking about are moral norms, which for the most part should be obvious, given that we're talking about morality and moral philosophy and whatnot. But it's worth clearing up because when we talk about what people should do in a given situation or what's right to do, we can use those terms in a lot of different ways. We can use the terms right and ought and should to refer to things that are purely practical. You ought to do this because it'll help you accomplish your goal. Or we'll talk about social conventions like etiquette or laws. For example, in the United States, you shouldn't steal; it's against the law. So, there's a legal norm that says that you will go to jail if you end up stealing things. But that's not the kind of thing that we're focused on. Instead, we want to focus on moral norms. So we're not going to care or study much about what the law is or about what a society believes on these given topics. There's one or two places where we will refer to them as a little bit of a guide or a suggestion as a starting point for our sorts of issues, namely on our unit on free speech and corruption and that sort of thing. But that's not our end all be all focus. Instead, we're going to be looking at morality in general, and we're also going to be discussing what morality is in fact, not what people think it is. Again, a few minutes ago, I mentioned that we don't do the kinds of things that sociologists and anthropologists do. Those sorts of folks do what we might call descriptive ethics. They go out in the world, they perform scientific measures, they do ethnographies or surveys or whatever else, and they try and figure out what an actual society or culture uh, does believe. What do they believe at this point in time, at this location in the world? And we're not really worried about all that. Instead, we are going to try and dig into what's actually true about morality. Now, whether or not that's possible is a little bit of an open question, which is why we're going to address it a little bit in this unit. But it's worth noting that this is our goal for the semester, is to try and dig into what morality is actually like, as opposed to just what people think it is. We'll look at some different perspectives, and we'll consider them as proposals and ideas and evaluate them, but they're not our primary focus. Now, it's also worth mentioning that when we do this kind of moral philosophy, and when we dig into these kinds of questions, there are a few background assumptions that we make, some things that we need to be clear about, and it's helpful to make explicit so that as we approach everything else, we can make reference to these or all be on the same page as we try and solve problems. And so the four general principles that our textbook talks about that we'll treat sort of as a background assumption for doing all this stuff are these. The first of which is what our book refers to as the preeminence of reason. And this is very simply the idea that moral judgments need to be backed by reasons and careful thought. It's not enough for us to just have gut reactions to things. When we deal with moral problems, we need to have good reasons for our judgments about particular situations. If we decide that, yes, it's perfectly okay to push the fat man off the bridge and kill him to save the workers down below, it's not enough to just say, oh, well, I believe it is, or I think it is, or my preacher told me that it's okay. That's generally not good enough. It definitely won't make for a good explanation to the fat man's widow. But just in general, that's not enough justification for dealing with something as serious as a moral problem, especially ones that deal with life and death. So, in general, we want to make sure that we actually use reasons and careful thought and reflection and arguments when we try and come up with our moral judgments and when we analyze problems. Now, the second sort of thing to keep in mind is that we also want to try and do all of this from a universal sort of perspective. When we talk about moral philosophy and moral problems, we want the claims and the ideas and the principles that we come up with to apply to everybody, at least insofar as they can. Moral statements and moral judgments should apply to every relevantly similar situation if we're doing it right, if we're taking the right sort of perspective. And this is simply the idea that if we decide, say tomorrow, that killing is wrong, well, the idea that killing is wrong should apply every time that there's a particular situation that's like that. Now, it doesn't have to apply everywhere at all times, and we'll talk a little bit about the difference between absolutism and just simply having this sort of perspective. Absolutism being the idea that there are no exceptions to something. But it's worth noting that so long as two situations are relevantly similar, that is, they've got the right kinds of similarities between them, what's moral or immoral in one situation should also be the same in the other situation. If they're going to change, there should be a reason for it. There should be an actual exception worked into the principles and the things that we talk about. Similarly, we want to try and be impartial when we do all of this sort of moral philosophy stuff. The same principles and judgments should apply to every person, provided that things are, again, relevantly similar. If it's wrong for you to steal candy from the candy store, it should also be wrong for me to steal candy from the candy store. Now, it may be different if I'm stealing bread to feed my family. That may not be a relevantly similar situation anymore. There may be a relevant difference between the two situations. But we want to try and be, as impartial as we can be, so that we're getting a real core of morality and not just something that benefits a few and harms a whole lot of others. And it's also worth noting that in general, when we do moral philosophy, we're going to assume the dominance of moral norms. That is, that moral concerns, issues of morality are going to be more pressing and more important over other sorts of concerns. That when we talk about it being right or wrong to do something, that sort of worry should be more important than, oh, well, it would benefit me, or, oh, it's easy to do, or it's inconvenient to do. Those sorts of worries shouldn't really play all that much of a role in morality and ethics. It takes something that most of us have the experience of being the true, that doing the right thing sometimes is very hard. It's very difficult. The fact that something's difficult on its own shouldn't be a reason to treat it as immoral, though. So we're definitely generally going to assume that moral norms, that moral principles and worries take precedence over a lot of other concerns, almost all other concerns. And that kind of covers the basics of what moral philosophy is. Over the next few lectures, we're going to look at this stuff in a little bit greater detail. We're going to look at moral reasoning, what a moral theory is and how we should evaluate them, what criteria should we use to evaluate moral theories. And we'll also look at some basic meta-ethical issues, namely whether or not there actually are right answers to these kinds of problems and questions. Because until we answer that, it's very difficult for us to move forward with this stuff. So until then, good luck. Take a look at your readings and the checklist for the unit. And happy thinking, guys.